Welcome back to the deep dive.
It's good to be here.
So today we're jumping into Volume 7. And
hmm
this one feels really central to everything we build as a society.
It is.
We're calling it the human ledger, and we're really examining the history, the function, the whole architecture of our justice systems.
Right. We're asking this fundamental question about how a society deals with its own internal tension, with its own breakdowns.
And it forces us, right from the start, to look at something pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's right there on our first slide.
It is. It's the truth that really anchors this whole deep dive. We punish what we don't yet know how to heal.
Say more about that.
Well, when a society just lacks the language or the skill set or maybe just the collective will to restore a person to balance, the default historically has always been the same thing.
Exclusion.
Exclusion, removal, or pain. It's the fallback.
And that exclusion, it isn't just an idea. It takes a very physical, very tangible form. You mentioned stone walls. And looking at the second slide here, prisons reveal a culture's fears. These buildings are so much more than just places of confinement, aren't they? They're almost like involuntary cultural artifacts.
That's a perfect way to put it. Involuntary. I mean, if you want to understand the soul of a civilization, don't look at its temples or its banks.
Look at its prisons.
Look at what it chooses to lock away. Throughout history, prisons are the physical architecture of a culture's unspoken fears. They tell you exactly what counted as harm at any given time.
Who is seen as deserving protection.
And so critically, whose suffering was just invisible, or even seen as deserved. The pattern is the same across all eras, whether you're talking about a tribal circle or a modern supermax prison.
What's the pattern?
When people stop knowing how to help, they start building places to hide the problem, to contain their own fear.
That frame is so important for this whole discussion. We're really tracing this long and, let's be honest, very messy arc of how society has dealt with wrongdoing.
Yeah.
From these ancient ritual responses all the way to the massive, incredibly complex institutions we have today.
And to do that, we've structured this journey. If you look at our third slide, we've broken it down into 3 acts.
Right. So where are we going today?
Okay, first, we're going to analyze the old blueprint. We'll trace the foundational logic of punishment, which is really a logic of fear, through 4 distinct historical eras.
Okay.
Second, we'll confront the breaking point, that's the present, the unsustainable human crisis of mass incarceration, and we'll diagnose the engines that drove us here.
And then the future.
And finally, Act 3, we'll explore the new paradigm, the shift to what we call healing-centered justice, and how a continuum-style lens helps us reframe justice not as retribution, but as systemic regulation.
Let's start with that historical blueprint then, Act 1.
Let's do it.
You're saying that across all these different eras we've studied, the central logic always came down to one thing: managing instability, establishing control.
Exactly. Harm, no matter how it was defined, was always seen as a tear in the social or even the cosmic fabric, something that had to be fixed.
So that underlying goal of restoring order, that never changed.
It never changed. But what did change dramatically was the mechanism society thought was necessary to get there. And that was always dictated by what that particular society feared the most.
So we're moving from a fear of the gods
To a fear of economic inefficiency, to a fear of the uncontrollable human mind. The fear changes, but the reaction control stays the same.
Okay, so let's go all the way back. Era 1, slide 4 says, when punishment was a ritual, this is long before written laws, before prisons were actual stone buildings. You're saying punishment was a belief system, a ritual. What did that actually look like?
Well, the intuitive layer here is deeply, deeply relational. I mean, think about early human groups. Before we had all this specialization, the most fragile and important resource was the social fabric itself.
The group.
The group. Survival was the group. So harm wasn't a legal category, it was a disruption, an instability in relationships or in the cosmic order. The initial goal wasn't really to punish the individual, it was to restore the group's equilibrium, to repair the fabric.
And the first forms of prison weren't buildings at all, they were social boundaries. You're talking about exile and shunning.
Absolutely, exile. I mean, that was probably the most devastating fate a human could suffer back then, because belonging was survival.
It was a death sentence.
It was a social death, which usually led to a physical death. Being removed from the circle, especially in a harsh environment, the logic of the group was stark. It was almost mathematical.
Which was?
We cannot maintain stability with your current behavior inside the circle. It was that simple.
And shunning?
Just as potent. Shunning is the withdrawal of attention, of recognition, of any relational responsiveness. And because our nervous systems are fundamentally wired to need that relational apron, that social connection, it's a profound form of punishment.
So these earliest strategies taught us a lesson that we've kind of carried with us ever since.
A fundamental one, yes. That removing a person preserves the perceived order of the group.
And alongside just kicking people out, there's this idea of punishment as purification. The pain, the rituals, the public spectacle. These weren't just random acts of violence, they were ceremonies.
Exactly. They were used to repair the unseen. This is so crucial to get. Early societies often believed that disorder attracted tangible dangers, plague, famine, the wrath of the gods. A crime wasn't just against another person. It was an infection on the whole community.
So the pain was symbolic.
It was a tool to symbolically cleanse that disorder and restore cosmic harmony. A ritual beating, public humiliation. The suffering was seen as a necessary, transformative instrument. It neutralized a kind of spiritual contamination and reset the moral landscape.
Yeah.
The ritual confirmed that enough had been paid to restore the balance, the ma'at, in the world.
So in this era, the focus was really on restoring the external order of the group, even if the method was, well, brutal.
Precisely. The focus was the collective stability, the tribe's survival. The individual was, in many ways, secondary to that need for purification or restabilization.
Okay, that brings us to Era 2, on slide 5, when deviance became a sin. As you have centralized institutions starting to grow, early states, organized religion, that idea of a fluid imbalance, it shifts into something much more rigid, more absolute.
It does. The fear of disorder becomes the fear of the uncontrollable. And punishment becomes about containing a perceived threat.
The core concept here changes completely, doesn't it?
It's a dramatic shift. Justice moves from repairing a communal tear to controlling the individual who is now seen as the source of corruption. Fear of divine punishment, fear of political disorder that reshape the entire system.
And that's when we see things like dungeons emerge.
Right, and dungeons, for example, they weren't initially designed for long-term sentences like we think of them today. They were spiritual holding places.
Waiting rooms.
Waiting rooms, exactly. Places where the accused soul was held still while the system decided its fate, and that fate was almost always framed by theological judgment.
And this brings in a new theology of punishment. The goal becomes confession. And the mechanism, disturbingly, is torture.
Yeah. Confession wasn't just about getting evidence of guilt. It was seen as the path to salvation for both the state and the individual soul. The state needed the truth to restore order, and the soul needed to admit its sin to get right with the divine.
And that belief system is what justified torture.
It's what made torture seem, in the mind of the inquisitor, like a theological necessity. You were inducing pain to force the soul to reveal the truth and submit to the divine order. It was a profoundly fear-based worldview, the belief that truth, and therefore safety, had to be painfully extracted from the body.
In this era, it created some of the most destructive feedback loops in history. The witch hunts are a primary example where just being different or vulnerable was weaponized.
Absolutely. This era is a case study in the danger of treating difference as danger. The system started treating vulnerability, poverty, mental distress, not conforming as proof of evil, as spiritual corruption.
The accusations followed social anxieties.
Deeply. What we now understand as mental illness, or trauma adaptation, or even complex grief, that was often misinterpreted as demonic possession because the society had no other language for that kind of internal suffering. So they projected their collective stress, their internal tension, outward. They blamed the most vulnerable people for the community's unease.
So the system basically learned to treat suffering as suspicion.
Yes. That reinforced a terrifying cycle of fear.
It's just chilling to realize how easily a lack of understanding translates directly into violent control.
That's the hallmark of this era. When we're afraid and we don't understand something, we prioritize removal over connection. Every time.
Okay, let's fast forward. Era 3, industrial punishment, slide 6. When productivity became virtue, the whole calculation changes again. Punishment merges with economics. It's no longer about your spiritual failure, but about whether you contribute to the economic engine.
Right. The logic of the factory floor becomes the blueprint for justice.
The central question society starts asking is, are you productive?
That's it. And poverty, not having a stable job, that was aggressively reframed. It wasn't a systemic failure anymore. It was a moral failing of your character. Idleness became a crime against the state's economic interests.
And that's what gives rise to institutions like workhouses and debtors' prisons.
Exactly. They were designed specifically to reshape what were seen as unproductive bodies into compliant working bodies.
And in this shift, the incarcerated people themselves become assets, economic assets.
Precisely. Prisons become labor machines. You see the rise of systems like chain gangs, convict leasing, penal colonies, all used to extract labor, often disguised under the moral justification of correction or rehabilitation.
Even the architecture of prisons started to change.
It evolved to mirror the factory floor. I mean, think about the panopticon design, that architectural vision of Jeremy Bentham where every single inmate could potentially be watched at all times.
That's not just surveillance.
No, it's control optimized for maximum compliance and minimal resistance. It's about efficiency. And profit motives, particularly in the post-Civil War American South, directly began shaping sentencing practices. You saw longer and longer sentences being handed down just to maintain the labor supply. The value of an incarcerated body was measured strictly by its economic output.
So justice became a commodity, a tool to regulate the labor market.
That's the hardest conclusion of this era, but it's the truth. The system became less and less concerned with why harm occurred and was almost entirely fixated on ensuring that a person was contributing to the structural economic current of the society.
Which brings us to a conceptual shift that sounds like progress, but it hides a real danger. Era 4 on slide 7. The psychological era when crime became pathology. Society discovers the mind. We start reframing wrongdoing as a mental condition to be diagnosed and treated.
And the promise there was huge. I mean, for the first time, society was acknowledging that maybe people harm others because they themselves are hurting or dysregulated or shaped by their environment. It shifted the blame from sin to science.
We started talking about mental illness, deficiency, social rehabilitation.
But the peril was that the diagnosis itself very quickly became a new, more sophisticated tool for control. The state began using psychological assessments to justify long-term segregation, and what started as a promise of medical help often became coercive control.
I want to pause on that peril. The sources highlight a critical blind spot that just undermined this whole era, even with its new focus on the mind.
And that blind spot was the invisible wound of trauma. This is a point we absolutely cannot miss.
Explain that.
Behaviors that are really just adaptations to overwhelming experiences. Things like defiance, aggression, emotional withdrawal, hypervigilance, they were seen purely as stable disorders, as inherent defects in the person.
You can see echoes of the early eugenics movement there.
You can. It influenced diagnostic categories, suggesting that certain pathologies were fixed and inherited. The system learned how to use the language of healing, rehabilitation, correction, treatment, while fundamentally maintaining the underlying architecture of control and exclusion it had inherited from the previous three eras.
So pathology replaced context.
Yes, we learned how to label the symptom without ever addressing the root cause.
So if we summarize all of Act 1, which you do on slide 8, this entire historical blueprint from ritual purification all the way to psychological diagnosis, it was ultimately driven by one core, unifying, and really uncomfortable truth.
Yes, the truth, as that slide says, is simple and it's uncomfortable. Fear not safety built the blueprint we inherited.
The system was built on this constant pressure to contain threats.
Whether those threats were seen as spiritual, economic, or psychological, it didn't matter. And that system, built on a foundation of fear, eventually reached its ultimate breaking point.
That is a powerful place to transition. Let's connect that historical architecture of control directly to the crisis that we're facing today.
Okay.
Act 2, the breaking point, mass incarceration. So that fear-based blueprint, it was eventually built to an unsustainable, almost catastrophic scale. Slide 9 really frames this as the breaking point.
It does.
And looking at that graph of the U.S. incarceration rate from 1925 to 2015, I mean, the line is mostly flat for decades, and then it just shoots straight up.
It's an exponential curve.
Especially from the 1970s onward. This wasn't a gradual trend that corresponded to crime rates, was it?
No. Not at all. That acceleration you see in the graph is deeply disturbing. The explosion was not a natural response to some surge in underlying crime. It was the result of turning collective fear into policy and infrastructure.
We built an infrastructure for fear.
We built an infrastructure purely for containment and exclusion. We started treating incredibly complex social problems like poverty, addiction, mental illness, as if they were criminal problems. We essentially took that flawed historical blueprint and we built it into a skyscraper. And now we're seeing the structural collapse.
Okay, so let's diagnose that collapse. Slide 10 talks about the three engines of mass incarceration. What were the primary forces that drove this unsustainable growth?
Okay, engine number one was fear as policy. This is where that historical blueprint directly manifests in legislation. Panic was aggressively turned into law,
Often driven by media, right?
often driven by intense media focus on sensationalized, rare events. This is when we saw the rise of mandatory minimum sentences, three strikes laws, and zero-tolerance policies.
Zero tolerance. That's essentially emotional governance, isn't it?
That's a great way to put it. It removes all context. It removes judicial discretion. It means legislators basically outsource their fear to the judiciary and to law enforcement. And the data shows that this period prioritized the length of the penalty over any kind of effectiveness. Control was the primary and often the only tool for governance.
Okay, so that's the first engine. The second engine you mentioned on the slide gets back to what you said about the industrial era, the criminalization of poverty.
This is where survival behaviors become criminalized in ways that disproportionately affect the poor. I mean, just think about fines and fees in the modern bail system.
It's a two-tier system.
It fundamentally creates a two-tier justice system where your freedom depends directly on your wealth.
Mm.
If you're poor, a small traffic fine or a public nuisance fee can quickly escalate into debt. That debt leads to warrants, which leads to arrest.
And marginalized communities become the usual suspects.
They do, because enforcement patterns, policing, focuses overwhelmingly on those communities. The system essentially extracts wealth and freedom from the poor, all while disguising this economic disparity as a moral failure.
And the third engine, warehousing trauma. This really exposes the system's complete internal collapse. It's an inability to perform even its claimed function of rehabilitation.
This is the breaking point for the human spirit. Prisons, especially when they're overcrowded, become trauma amplifier. They take individuals who often have deep histories of violence, neglect, and chronic stressed nervous systems that are already in a high state of alert, and they place them in environments defined by unpredictability, loss of control, and isolation. The punitive environment just intensifies old wounds instead of healing them.
And the stress makes any kind of real treatment impossible.
Functionally impossible. The goal of the institution is containment. And by focusing purely on control, the only thing it really succeeds in producing is more distress and ultimately more future harm.
You mentioned the trauma for incarcerated people, but slide 11 makes a critical point that is so often ignored. The punitive environment destabilizes everyone involved. It's a shared stress pattern.
It is absolutely vital that we understand this systemic reciprocity. Punitive environments destabilize staff and residents equally, just in different ways. We see these deeply concerning parallel wounds.
So what does that look like for the staff, for correctional officers?
Well, correctional staff experience chronic exposure to conflict, to burnout, hypervigilance, and alarmingly elevated rates of PTSD. They are structurally forced into roles of constant enforcement and suspicion. They're often exposed to more traumatic events than even military personnel in combat zones.
So the system is just pitting two groups of highly stressed, often very dysregulated people against each other.
Exactly. The environment itself is the problem. It generates a shared stress pattern that's built on fear, and the cycle just accelerates.
How so?
Officers are constantly vigilant, so they interpret trauma responses from residents like defiance or withdrawal as intentional threats. Residents, or just struggling to cope, interpret the commands and the hypervigilance of the officers as danger cues, which reinforces their own fight-or-flight response.
So it's not about bad people or bad officers.
No, the system is architected to reinforce mutual dysregulation. Trying to reform a prison without addressing this shared trauma and stress environment. It's like trying to fix a leaky dam by bailing out the water with a spoon. You have to change the foundational structure.
I think that connection, that the system harms everyone caught in its orbit, is such a necessary moment of reflection on the immense weight of this history.
It forces us to ask, what kind of architecture creates conditions for stability and connection instead of tension and fear?
And that shared dysregulation, it really highlights the total systemic failure of the old blueprint.
It does.
And yet, the crisis itself has forced a necessary reevaluation. Slide 12 talks about cracks in the old walls, revealing light.
And that light is the evidence-based realization that control cannot produce genuine safety. It can only produce temporary compliance. The crisis has forced a philosophical shift. We're moving past just asking what should we do to people who harm,
To asking a better question.
to asking the more constructive question. What broke here? And what structural conditions must we create to prevent this breakdown in the future? And that shifts our focus entirely to Act 3. the new paradigm.
The ultimate transition from a system built on containment to one built on capacity. Okay, so this is where we introduce the new paradigm on slide 13. This is anchored in modern neuroscience and public health models, and the core principle, which I think is often really misunderstood by the public, is this. Punishment does not create safety. Healing does.
And this is not idealism, it's actuarial. It's evidence-based. The data is definitive on this. Human stability and genuine relational connection are the most effective predictors of long-term public safety.
So we anchor this new paradigm on 3 pillars.
3 core pillars, yes. Dignity as a stabilizer, regulation over punishment, and repair over revenge.
Let's start with the first one because it feels revolutionary. Dignity is a stabilizer, not a luxury, on slide 14. It's the idea that dignity is an operational tool, not just a human right that has to be earned. The Scandinavian model is often held up as proof that these humane structures are actually effective.
Yeah.
So what are the core architectural principles driving their radically different and much, much lower recidivism rates?
Okay, so their foundational principle is normalization. The life inside the facility must resemble life outside as much as possible.
Why is that so important?
To preserve the individual's identity, their community bonds, their vocational skills, they deliberately avoid creating a dehumanizing environment. People are treated as citizens who are temporarily separated from society, not as a separate, dangerous caste. They are framed from day one as future neighbors, and that changes everything.
And that normalization must require a massive shift in the role of the staff, moving away from that guard mentality.
A total shift. They implement what they call relational security. Officers are trained not as enforcers first, but as professional caregivers, mentors, and relational anchors. Their primary tool is building trust and stabilizing the environment, not dominance.
And that creates dignity.
That creates dignity. And when you treat people with respect, it actively regulated their nervous systems. It increases their capacity for responsibility and accountability.
And the data speaks for itself.
The data speaks volumes. The U.S. recidivism rate sits consistently around 60% or higher within 3 years. Scandinavian nations maintain rates around 20%. Humane systems are demonstrably, structurally more effective at achieving public safety. It's not even a debate anymore.
But I have to ask the question, for an audience that's accustomed to this historical fear-based model where punishment is supposed to equal suffering, how do you deal with the political pressure? If people demand retribution, isn't normalization seen as letting people off easy?
That is the crucial political and cultural hurdle. And the short answer is that the system has to lead with long-term safety data, not short-term emotional satisfaction. Retribution feels good in the moment, it's cheap, but it's structurally unsound. It guarantees high recidivism, which costs communities and victims more suffering in the long run.
So the Scandinavian model is actually prioritizing the victim's long-term safety.
It is, it says. We are prioritizing your long-term safety by creating a system that actually works, even if it doesn't align with that historical impulse for revenge. It demands that the system define its success by the safe return of its citizens, not by the severity of the punishment.
Which brings us directly to the trauma-informed justice framework on the next slide. This shifts the core lens from moral blame to genuine insight by asking that foundational question, what happened to you? Instead of, what's wrong with you?
This is the moment where we integrate the knowledge from modern science. The science is overwhelming on this point. Most harmful behavior is a downstream reactive expression of overwhelming stress or earlier relational wounds.
So it's a state of nervous system dysregulation.
Exactly. It's not a stable moral choice or a fixed identity. When the nervous system gets overwhelmed, the body shifts into survival modes, fight, flight, or freeze, which then manifest externally as defiance, aggression, impulsivity, or dissociation.
And as we just established in Act 2, traditional punishment just compounds this dysregulation. It locks the person deeper into that survival mode.
It does. Punishment intensifies the dysregulation. If you try to enforce compliance on a brain that is already in a state of panic, you make clear thinking and genuine accountability impossible.
So the goal has to be regulation.
The goal is regulation. Accountability is only possible once regulation is restored, when the person can actually access their prefrontal cortex, reflect on the harm they caused, feel genuine remorse, connect with others, and understand the impact of their actions. An offense is treated as a severe moment of dysregulation, not a permanent marker of who they are. The treatment has to match the root cause, which is so often a dysregulated nervous system struggling to cope with life's demands.
Okay, so now we anchor the future of justice in the deeper framework that we've explored throughout this curriculum, the continuum style lens.
Mhm.
It defines justice not as retaliation, but as structural regulation.
And this requires a massive conceptual shift. It's summarized there on slide 16. We have to use a new conceptual anchor, which in our curriculum is the framework of Mahat.
Which is?
For our listeners, you can understand Mahat simply as the ancient Egyptian concept of cosmic and social balance, order, and justice. The core idea is that harmful behavior is not a moral flaw, but a temporary architectural imbalance in a person's internal system.
Like a circuit that's overloaded or a beam that's weakened.
Exactly. The goal is to restore that structural balance, not to assign blame.
Let's use the four currents of the continuum to illustrate how this internal architecture works. We'll use the names of the currents, structure, connection, reflection, and renewal, as our map.
Okay. So think of these four as the essential supporting beams of a healthy human system. When a person is operating under severe stress or trauma, these four elements fall out of cooperation with each other. For instance, structure, the organizational stability current, it might become overly dominant.
Which leads to rigidity.
Rigidity, dogmatic inflexibility, or an oppressive need for control over others. The individual is trying to survive by imposing order, but it collapses their ability to connect or to reflect.
And what about the failure modes that involve connection?
If connection, the relational belonging current, collapses, which is so common after severe relational trauma or neglect, the person loses the capacity for empathy, for emotional warmth, for social engagement. This leads to that defensive withdrawal and dissociation we've talked about in earlier volumes.
And that often precedes violent acts.
It does, because the relational tether to other people is severed. And conversely, if reflection, the processing, vigilance current, goes into a runaway state, you get excessive vigilance, paranoia, and fragmentation. The person generates too many incompatible realities and believes they are constantly under threat.
So instead of seeing a criminal, we're seeing a human system whose internal architecture has failed due to overwhelming stress.
That's it.
The solution then is architectural reconstruction.
Precisely. If your house's structure is compromised, you don't punish the house. You rebuild the beams and you restore the foundation. Justice has to adopt this restorative architectural view of human beings.
The old way relied on single, static labels, aggressive, defiant. But the continuum lens demands a much more dynamic, precise understanding, a multi-axis diagnosis, as you call it, on slide 17. How does this mapping approach help target the intervention?
It replaces the punitive label with a comprehensive map of needs across four essential diagnostic axes. This level of precision allows us to answer why the behavior happened, not just what happened. And that makes the intervention functional rather than just generalized.
Okay, let's break down those four axes of diagnosis.
So first, the internal state. The emotional axis asks, how regulated is their nervous system? Are they constantly in survival mode? The goal there is stabilization.
Okay.
Second, the cognitive axis. This asks, how stable is their thinking under stress? Are they able to plan, reflect, and evaluate risk? Or are they experiencing the tunnel vision of panic? This helps us determine the need for cognitive restructuring or skill building.
And then we have to broaden the scope to include the environmental contributors.
Exactly. The environmental axis examines external pressures, things like chronic poverty, housing instability, food insecurity, or community violence that are all contributing to the dysregulation. This shows us where structural support must be injected.
And the last one.
Finally, the developmental axis assesses what foundational skills or capacities, emotional regulation, executive functioning, social reciprocity, were interrupted by early trauma or a lack of resources. Were they prevented from maturing their sense of structure or their sense of connection?
The power of this is that instead of a one-size-fits-all prison sentence, you get a personalized, phased plan for recovery.
That's the crucial takeaway. This detailed diagnosis allows for targeted interventions that address the root causes and provide the missing internal and external architecture that's needed for stable, regulated functioning. It shifts resources away from just containment and toward genuine healing.
If we synthesize all this, the contrast between the old punitive model and the new healing model is a total shift in worldview. You lay this out on slide 18.
Absolutely. The punitive model, it operates on the assumption of moral failure. Its goal is control and deterrence. Its tools are punishment and isolation. Its outcome is trauma and, ironically, high recidivism. And it defines a person's identity rigidly as criminal.
whereas the healing model sees a breakdown, not a flaw.
The healing model defines its goal as regulation and repair. Its lens is architectural imbalance. Its tools are stabilization and connection. And the outcome is safety and reintegration, because it recognizes that the stability of the entire society is dependent on the stability of its citizens. The identity shifts dramatically to a person in a state of repair, which recognizes that accountability is strongest when it is supported by structural stability.
This new paradigm completely redefines the very function of incarceration itself, doesn't it? It moves us away from moral sentencing. So if we use this continuum lens, what is the legitimate role of confinement?
Well, if we accept this new frame, prison is not a moral sentence. It's a necessary tool of acute crisis management. It becomes a brief, structured pause during an acute internal or external crisis.
Like a hospital's crisis stabilization unit.
Exactly like that. Its purpose is to reduce intensity and restore basic nervous system regulation, not to inflict suffering or exact revenge. It is temporary containment used for safety.
Which means it requires two very clear, separate phases of intervention and funding.
Precisely. Phase 1 is short-term containment. You're providing a safe, predictable environment to stabilize the nervous system, getting the person out of immediate danger and out of that high alert state. But this must immediately transition to Phase 2, long-term community care.
Which involves
Intensive healing, therapy, skill building, and robust relational support. And the critical point is that the default is return to community. Reintegration is not a reward to be earned after good behavior. It is the fundamental expected outcome of the stabilization process. The system measures its success by stability and safe return, not by the length of time served.
So the confinement phase is merely the structural setup, the structure current,
Yeah.
that's necessary before the real work of connection and reflection can even begin.
That's the architectural breakdown. You can't start rebuilding the house while the hurricane is still blowing. Confinement provides the calm, structured environment needed to interrupt the pattern of dysregulation so that the deeper long-term healing work can be effective.
We began this entire deep dive by holding up a mirror to the walls we build. Let's revisit that premise now. We're looking at slide 20, what our justice system says about us.
The mirror reflects a very clear choice, and we can't equivocate on this. A society's prisons reveal everything it fundamentally believes about people: their inherent worth, the depth of their wounds, and the reach of their potential.
A system built on fear.
Exposes its own fear. A system built on distrust exposes its own wounds. So the core question for leaders, for policymakers, and for you, for the listener, has to be, do we want our justice system to reflect our collective fear or our collective humanity? We cannot have both.
And this change can't be driven by those at the bottom of the system, by the people who are already overwhelmed by the lack of power and that constant state of dysregulation.
No. As slide 21 emphasizes, change begins with those who hold power. A person who is dysregulated and contained in a cell cannot change the architecture of the institution. Those who control the levers of the system, the legislators, the judges, the system administrators, the officers, they carry the first and the largest responsibility to change the environment. Responsibility scales directly with the influence you hold.
So if you're listening and you hold structural power, as a leader, a manager, a policymaker, what is your actionable task from this deep dive?
Your task is to change environments, to fund and build systems where people can regulate, grow, and return, to use structure to create safety, not to create control. Your focus must be on resource allocation for community stability.
And if you hold social privilege, meaning you have stable resources, a political voice,
Your task is to share stability. Advocate for resources like housing, education, and early mental health support that prevent the structural imbalances that lead to harm in the first place. You are responsible for amplifying the stability that you may take for granted.
and if you are simply part of a community, the most fundamental level of support.
Your task is to create the conditions for stability locally, connection, support, and belonging. Because the individual healing journey of returning to balance requires a stable network to hold it, especially when that person is transitioning back from containment. We are all responsible for the relational environment.
It sounds like a total shift in our collective operating system, the move toward post-punishment system. You're saying it's not theoretical, it's already forming based on the evidence.
It is not a fantasy. It is already forming in health systems, in innovative justice centers, and in communities globally. The question is whether we are willing to become the society that our future systems need us to be. Safety, as we show on slide 22, grows when systems reduce tension rather than increase it.
And you define this tension as the internal tension index.
Yes, the ITI, a metric that measures the collective stress level, the fear, The hypervigilance, the dysregulation within a closed system, whether that's a family, an office, or a prison. We must let go of control as our main safety strategy and intentionally build systems that reduce that ITI by prioritizing regulation and relational stability.
Thank you. This entire volume has been a really profound look at how our internal architecture, those seasonal movements of structure, connection, reflection, and renewal, is reflected, often brutally, in the social architecture we build around us.
The future of justice begins wherever someone decides that healing is more powerful and, frankly, more effective than punishment. It requires profound courage to let go of old fears and embrace the precision of human understanding and compassion.
We encourage you then to apply this continuum lens to your own community, your own environment. Where are structures too rigid? Where is connection insufficient? And where can you intentionally introduce balance, understanding that support and belonging are the truest forms of public safety?
This has been Volume 7, The Human Ledger. Thank you for diving deep with us.
The knowledge is now yours to act upon.